They were fighting for the town towards the end of war. I know that there were tanks in a field. There were tanks in a field because I could hear the shells. I could hear them. But my mother, in the meantime, pulled us under the bunk and told us to get down. We were going home.
Liberation Day, at last. Welcome back. I'm Ollie Guillou, and this is the story of the Guernsey Deportees. After 3 long years in captivity came a day that will be remembered for the rest of time. News had made it to the camp. The Allies had won the war, and the islanders in bivouac were given their first promise of freedom.
I quickly packed my bag, packed my panda, put in my bag, and went and joined her under the bed. And then I wanted to know when we were going home. But we had to wait a few weeks for that.
Unfortunately, winning the war didn't mean a straight path home for these islanders, this community. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of waiting. It wasn't even clear that they'd ever see Guernsey again. Just like the path into the camp, the path out was long and winding.
When we went on because we were relieved slightly before Guernsey, and we were out on the camp listening to the big loudspeaker box as when Churchill came out. I remember listening to him. Obviously, we didn't have a clue who Churchill was and why like that, but obviously our parents were very, very taken by it. To be standing in Germany free, hearing that, was something I do remember.
And our dear Channel Islands are also to be freed today.
We were rescued by the French Moroccan troops, which they were a bit, surly. You wouldn't speak to them. Don't go near them. And then the Americans came, and that's the first time we've tasted chocolate and had chewing gum, and I'll never forget them. They're the first soldiers I saw smile ever. So I'll always remember them and thank them. They took us around the town and then brought us back up. It was interesting to see it.
So at the time of the liberation of the camp, were you sort of swarmed by Allied troops then, and they came and...
Well, the people who liberated us were a French tank squadron who made sure that they dealt with the Hitler Youth camp below us first and then turned up. But there were French around, and then very quickly American soldiers were around. The end of the war was happening around us. The Russians were coming in from one side, French were coming in from them, the Americans from there. I believe the French moved on, but a little aside, when we were allowed out into bivouac to see the town, we were told and given a red, white and blue Union Jack to put on one's shirts. This was to make sure that people were not Germans and when we went to the camp, because there were a lot of French troops who were African French, West African French British. They could be inclined to shoot anybody who looked like a German. These symbols for them to be recognised. But luckily, I think they moved on within 2 or 3 weeks.
Do you remember the feeling in the camp? Were people crying?
I think there was an excitement about it. And we were very quickly moved on from the camp, but not immediately sent from Germany. We were sent to a holding camp on an airfield where the Americans and Canadians were. It was a grass airstrip, which is now much more, about 40 miles away from bivouac, which is now a Ryanair, as I understand it.
And it was here at this airstrip that each family had to wait with bated breath, hoping and praying for the news that it would finally be their turn to fly.
I drove out of that camp in a lorry when I was that age, and they took us to this holding, it had tents, and they wrote up who was flying. You were given numbers when you're going to fly, and all to do with your name and everything like that. And we were one of the last planes to go out because of W. And I used to go down every day and look at the notice board and see if it was our turn to fly. I wanted to fly. And anyway, we did this day. We got on a plane. It was a Dakota, and it had parachutes hanging from it. And I sat with my dad on a bench, and my mum had my brother, and it was an electrical storm we flew through. And I think that affected my hearing in my left ear. I had trouble ever since that. Anyway, then, of course, we went to Burnley. That's the last time I was in bivouac and in Germany. And then, of course, as Alan said, we drove over the line inadvertently. I couldn't wait to get out. Talk about flying. Put your foot down. Yeah.
It was interesting to me to hear how this flight could have been what caused my grandma's hearing loss, how this one event so many years ago had a ripple effect throughout her life, not just emotionally but physically too, just as it did for Janet, who, as we discovered in an earlier episode, has no lining in her throat due to malnutrition. In the next episode, we'll explore the lifelong impact the camp has had on the deportees and the lasting legacy of this piece of history. But for now, back to Liberation Day and the moment when the flight that Grandma was waiting so patiently for had arrived.
We ended up in Burnley, staying with a grocer. He got a tablecloth out. I asked if it's somebody's birthday, because Mrs. Godwin had a cloth she used to put out for people's birthdays. They were nice people. That's where I thought I'd stay. I thought it was my home, till I realised there. And then we were told we were going to Guernsey. So that's what I remember.
Ralph left the airstrip with the Canadian Air Force on a propeller-driven aircraft called the Douglas DC-3, which was used during the war to transport paratroopers and glider-borne troops behind enemy lines.
We flew from there to Northolt in London.
So Burnley, London, the deportees ended up all over the place. They didn't just return to Guernsey, they were split up and sent to many different parts of the UK. Janet ended up in the south.
We stayed in Devon because my father had an aunt and uncle who had retired to Devon. And rather than coming directly back to Guernsey, we stayed for a short period in Devon.
And for some people, the UK became their permanent home, and they never did come back to the island. Some had lost everything, while others may have had family elsewhere or simply wanted a fresh start. For others, well, not everyone survived the journey back. Others were too weak to travel immediately and may have died in medical facilities in France or Germany. And then there are those who died in the camp while the war was still raging. Did people die in the camp while you were there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't remember offhand how many, but quite a few. Yeah. And they honour their memory the same day as the 23rd of April, where we honour our day over here. So at the same time, they're doing their service and we're doing our service here.
But many, many deportees were keen to return home, as you might imagine. But 3 years on, the island felt very different to them.
It's strange, actually, because we came back by boat and I wondered what my family looked like. I pictured princesses and people like that, and no, not quite like that. Poor little devils. They were thin as well. We were very thin and they were thin. So they'd been through a lot over here as well. I remember that, and then going up to live with my grandma, because that's the only reason we could get back, because we had to establish we had a place to come to, apparently. And I remember being my grandma and then going down to live in Route Isabel.
Yes, so apparently there's something quite amusing. When we got back, my cot was ready for me, kind of in our house where we lived. But unfortunately, I'd grown, so so I didn't fit into it. But I don't really remember, and just that. I mean, I had a very happy childhood in Coburg, and one thing. My parents wanted to send me to a private school here in St. Peter Port, and I just refused to go. A bus used to come and stop, and I'd refuse to get on it. And so in the end, they gave up And I was allowed to go to the local school, the Cattell school, with the local children. And that for me was fine. And, that helped me, to get back into the local community and make friends. And that was the effect,
And while the children were able to bounce back, kids are resilient, the weight of what had happened seems to have weighed very heavily on the shoulders of the adults. Janet says her mum was never the same again.
I was told that my mother originally was very, loved singing. She played the piano beautifully. All this type of thing was very popular over here in the island. When she came back, she was a different person. She wouldn't play the piano anymore. Well, you can understand that when you've been under threat for 2.5 years, wondering what's going to happen to you. If I remember correctly, things I've heard, there were Jewish people who came to Biberach, and they were then, sent off on trains. It was just a stopping point prior to the extermination. Her brother, who managed to escape Vienna as well, and he came over to the UK with the Free Czech Army. And they obviously kind of met up again after the war. And the first time we went over to visit him, he actually had bought a piano for my mother because he remembered her as somebody who was never, kind of far from a piano. And she just wouldn't sit down and touch it. I mean, she changed apparently, from what I hear. She was very, very different after to what she was before.
And is that something that carried with her for the rest of her life?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She wasn't a happy. I think it just, stemmed enjoying things, basically.
And through all of this change, some who returned felt like strangers in their own homes. Another deportee who I briefly mentioned last episode is a woman called Jill Oliver. Jill is 90, so she was 7 when she boarded the cargo ship and 10 when she was liberated from the camp. She now lives in the USA, and that's due, in part, to the feeling she and her family felt on arriving back to Guernsey after those 3 long years.
It was not long before we went to England. My dad's car was stolen, his boat, he had a sailboat, even the head was removed. Furniture in the house was all. My mother had fitted furniture made in, because they were quite wealthy in the island, and that was totally robbed from them. All the fitted furniture were pulled out of the walls and put in one room. At least it was put in one room. Now, we have no proof whether it was the Germans or the people on the island that did that. And Dad could not start his practice again. I was born in 39 Arcade, and that's where he had his practice. Again, it was a matter of them accepting us. My dad started 2 of his sons in the Pollock up in a business, a jewelry business. That got them started, but my dad couldn't do his dentistry anymore there, so we all went to England, and he associated, because he was much older, and to start doing another dental business was too hard on him. So he really didn't have a good life, my poor dad. But he loved America. He did end up coming, and he's buried here.
And Jill's was not an isolated experience, as Dr. Gilly Carr came to find out through her research.
One of the things that I realised right at the end of the book was the story of people coming back to the Channel Islands and finding their houses were looted, somebody else was living in their house, their business, their shop had been taken over by someone else. Basically, people came back to find they'd lost everything. And the kids had lost out on their education, people had lost out on earning money. And I think that these sorts of anecdotes are known, and they're known to have happened to a few people. But when I was doing my research, I found that it seems to have happened to everybody, that everybody came back to find, almost everybody came back to find their houses had been looted, that their house had been destroyed, that they basically had to come back and arrive back destitute and had to build up again. And I think this is much more common than has ever been acknowledged before. I think before it was assumed to have happened to a minority, but I think it was actually the majority.
Now, one thing that changed dramatically after the war was, of course, the language. In pre-war Guernsey, many people spoke Guernesiais, or Guernsey French. Although its use had declined over the years, around 25% of Guernsey's population still spoke it as their primary language. Many more understood it but preferred to use English. But, as Matt Lucas explains, by the end of the war, its decline accelerated.
Language-wise, it's not quite the death knell of the language, but it's a big thing. Because obviously a huge amount of young people go, they're the future of the language. They have several years in the UK. They're not speaking the language. They come back and you can see a sharp decline in the use of the language. It's the same in Jersey, of course, to 1945. So certainly there's a big impact in the language, big impact then in the culture. You know, I'd said at the start how life hadn't really changed much here for hundreds of years. Obviously, there's little bits it had. But after 1945, you see there is quite a change, certainly in culture when it comes to the language. These young people have been away 1940 to 45, whether they were in camps or whether they were evacuated to British cities. So when they come back, there's an attitude that people aren't quite the same again here. How has the land changed? Well, you can just drive around Guernsey and you will see the huge amount of concrete that the Germans have put in around the coast. To start with, those mines are there, the barbed wire is there. So it takes, a few years for all that to be cleared. And obviously the ground to be sculpted and made to look nicer. Scrap metal drives, cutting up the German guns that are still here. And then getting used to island life. So it changes a considerable amount. Go to somewhere like Alderney, which obviously the civilians are vast majority are evacuated in 1940. They come back. Alderney's really in ruins. It's completely wrecked. The Germans have taken everything out of the houses, anything they could burn in the end. Roofs have gone, doors, it's in the houses. Alderney's an absolute mess. And obviously you have a much darker history in Alderney. But it's quite different when the civilians get back. And as I said, for those children, 5 years away, 5 years for an adult is quite something. But for a child, your formative years, the impact is felt, and it will be really ever since, subconsciously as well as consciously. You go through a traumatic experience like that, it will affect you, but it will also affect future generations. They've done quite a few studies of people that were in places like Auschwitz, and that trauma does get passed on in all sorts of different ways. Food, freedom, things that you just really wouldn't think about. Now, of course, it's more of a tourist destination to do with that. But for the locals, 1945, 46, 47, 48, most of them weren't thinking that. They just wanted their old lives back and to just get rid of the thoughts of the occupation.
Guernesiais is now classed as a critically endangered language. Fortunately, there are some people still keeping it alive, like Jan Marquis, who I heard speak on a brilliant podcast all about the occupation of Guernsey called Islands at War. I'd highly recommend checking it out after you finish listening to this series. Now, this is just one of the lasting legacies of the war on Guernsey. In the next episode, we'll dig into other ways in which the Guernsey deportees' lives were forever altered by their experience, and why, 50 years later, they decided to make a return trip to the camp where they were once interned. And then when you went back to Biberach, what was that like?
I think it's terrible. I felt terrible.